The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She knows everything you do because the woman in your life is you.
Hello everybody and welcome to Women's Spaces. My name is Elaine Holtz and I'm your producer and host. And with me today is my dear friend Lilith Roger. And we have a special treat for you. Lilith wrote a book called It Slant, a dialogue between Emily Dickinson and Virginia Wolff. And we're going to read this particular piece of work, and I'm really excited. Thank you, Lilith. Thank you so much for allowing me to do this to you, with you. Not do this to you, do it with you. I'm so excited about it. It's really wonderful. So before we start, I'm gonna, as you know, I'm always in the studio here, and everything is always improvisation, and that's exactly what we're doing today. So let's begin. And when we come back, I am going to be Emily Dickinson, and Lilith is going to be Virginia Wolff, two of my favorite writers. So let's get going here.
Well, Emily, it appears you were right, and I was wrong about the question of immortality. For here we are together, seated comfortably in this fine room, more than a century after your own death, and nearly a half-century after mine.
Oh, I'm not so certain of that, Mrs. Wolff.
Please, my dear poet, do call me Virginia.
Oh, on our first meeting, you're quite certain. Well, then, Virginia, as I was saying, I'm not so sure. This lingering after death that we seem to be experiencing may be very well more truthfully explained through your understanding than mine. Did you feel that time was rather a more fluid element than we 19th century people proposed?
I was quite preoccupied with the concept of time in my writing.
Yes, I thought so. It seems that you proposed that just as one is constantly sipping in and out of one's own present and past in one's memory, so it is likely that one could slip in and out of one's own life through someone else's memory.
Well, I don't believe I ever put it quite that way, Emily, but now that you have, it does seem possible. I wish Leonard, Lytton, Vanessa, and my other Bloomsburys, that's what I called my friends, you know, were about to discuss it.
Would they have agreed with you, do you think?
Oh, probably not. But we did also enjoy a long and arduous discussion on just such a topic. I can just picture Lytton stroking his magnificent bush of a beard with those magnificent, elegant fingers of his and declaiming, "Yes, my dear Goat." Goat was my pet name, you see. "Yes, Goat, Einstein's theory of relativity does point the way towards some such notion as this, but are you taking into consideration, etc., etc.?"
Oh, before we go into this, please have some tea.
Thank you, thank you.
Oh, how fortunate you early 20th century folks were to have Einstein, Darwin, Freud, and Bergson to steer your thoughts out of your rutted channels of Christian doctrine. We poor 9th century intellectuals were bogged down in.
It must have been frighteningly dull for you, my dear.
Oh, indeed it was. How I longed to find some fresh approach to those important matters. But I was forced to make do with a choice between conversation and, what is this word? Infidelitism.
Yes, of course. I would have had no problem choosing infidelism myself, though my friend Tom Elliot did try to be a bit to convert me when he became a Catholic.
Oh, actually, I struggled very hard in my youth to become a Christian, to be saved, like many of my friends were doing. Some were bold enough to join with me for a little while in a club we rashly called the Impediments.
Penitence.
Impediments. Mary, Oh, I can't even pronounce my own word, Virginia. It's spelled Impenitents. You're such an intellectual. Would you pronounce it?
Penitent.
Oh, thank you. Mary Lyon, my teacher at Mount Holbrook, worried me about it so incessantly that I became ill, and Father thought I should return home. But still, I simply could not be dishonest enough to throw out my doubts on some matters and become a Christian. I could not accept such awful tenets as original sin and eternal damnation.
No, of course you couldn't. Not if you had a brain in your head.
Oh, just imagine, Virginia. They wanted me to believe that a sweet, delightful little child like my nephew Gilbert would burn forever in hell simply because he had not been baptized before his death. Terrible enough it was that typhoid should take him from Brother Austin, Sue, and me just when we were all so desperately needed such a life-affirming little creature about. No, I never could go along with such notions. As I wrote to Abba, my best friend of childhood, I am one of those lingering bad ones.
Oh, what nonsense. You, a bad one, Emily. Why, just look at you with those bright, warm, sensitive eyes, like the sherry the guest leaves in the glass, didn't you say once? Very like my own eyes, actually, and my best feature as well. Now, don't blush and turn away. You must learn to take compliments with more ease, dear. How will you ever be out amongst people again if you get so flustered by the least bit of attention?
Oh, don't say I must be out amongst folks, Virginia, for I simply can't bear it. People are so much,
Yes, I certainly do know. Haven't I spent all my life studying, trying to capture that muchness? Why, I used to follow complete strangers down the streets of London, trying to catch their accents, their mannerisms, their quaint turns of phrase.
Oh, how bold of you, Virginia, how bold.
I simply loved parties and social gatherings of all sorts, Emily. Lytton used to chastise me because I'd drag poor Leonard to all of Lady Adeline's balls. He'd say I was a snob and a social climber, but really all I wanted to do was gather a bit more material for the novel I was working on. You can't imagine, Emily, how distressed I'd be when those terrible doctors would declare, "Now, Mrs. W., no more parties until your nerves are quite settled." Actually, I felt as much deprived for the lack of parties as I did for the lack of my books and my writing, which they wouldn't let me have either at those times.
Actually, I can't imagine, Virginia, for I was much the same way in my youth. No one enjoyed an evening musical or sleigh ride more than I. What fun I had playing witty little improvisations on the piano for my family and friends. And though I was never a beauty like my dear sister Vinnie, I had plenty of beaux around me. Those Amherst boys enjoyed a sparkling humor and a warm friendship quite as much as a pretty face. But I never much was attracted to any one of them. You see, my strong affections always seemed to turn towards the girls and women in my life.
I certainly understand that. I was the same way. After I lost my wonderful, beautiful mother when I was only 13, she simply worked herself to death trying to be the angel of the house. And my beloved sister Stella, not much later, for much the same reasons. I suffered so for the lack of a woman's sensitivity. If it hadn't been for my sister Vanessa, I don't know what would have become of me. And then I began to get crushes. First, I simply adored my friend Violet Dickinson, and then it was Mabel Dodge, and oh, the passionate pages of prose I poured out to them.
You must have felt very much as I did for Sue Gilbert when I first met her. She was quite overwhelmed by my own passionate outbursts. Actually, she was so bright and lively and so much more in touch with the world than we Dickinsons that all of us were drawn to her. I thought her father would disapprove of her worldly ways, but no, he was in fact quite charmed by her. Why, after she married Austin and father built them the Italian villa next door to the mansion, he would often stop in of a morning for a second cup of coffee with her, and he had declared to us that 2 cups of coffee were excessive.
Oh, God, those Victorian fathers.
Yes.
Terribly controlling, weren't they? I know mine certainly was. But this Sue, she must have been quite special to you.
Oh, she was, Virginia, and for a while it was quite wonderful to have Sue so close and married to my Austin. I felt, one sister have I in our house, and one a hedge away. I sent her notes and presents of flowers for her table, and was so pleased for her and brother as the babies came. But I don't know quite what it was. There emerged a certain quality in Sue. Call it hardness, perhaps. Perhaps that came between us, between her and Austin as well. It saddened me deeply, only to see them gradually turn from one another, to lose their deep sharing that is the basis of a good marriage. Oh, it seems to me it should be, though of course I never experienced it.
And yet, you're exactly right about it, Emily. What would my life have been without my dear, dear Leonard to share it with? We spent so many, many pleasant hours together in conversation and long rambling walks at the printing press and mutual silence at our writing tables. We shared our experiences, our friends, our delights. It was Leonard who was the gardener in our family, and he was forever calling me out to the garden to exclaim over his roses as they bloomed or his cabbages as they ripened.
Well, it does sound like you shared a great deal.
Oh, yes. In fact, we were even able to share my happiness when I fell in love with Vida Sackville-West.
Oh.
I wrote to him of her magnificent figure, her legs like beech trees as she stalked about her estate, and of the wonderful meals she and I shared. For months with Vida, I enjoyed eating, a sensation I had never experienced before.
You haven't experienced the pleasures of good food?
Not really. I had such a delicate sensitivity, you know. Why, on my honeymoon with Leonard, I was so nervous, so afraid he would, of course, quite reasonably expect, being my husband and all. Fortunately, he understood. But still, I could not really eat, Emily. And when I was having one of my bad times, I simply felt such an aversion to food that I actually had to be force-fed. It makes me nauseous now, even just to discuss it.
Virginia, how dreadful for you.
Yes. Well, it was probably my half-brother George's fault for forcing himself on me when I was so young and vulnerable. But, as I was saying, during those few years when Vida and I were quite excited with one another, I feasted on so many of life's delights that I had never enjoyed before, not only eating, but kissing as well. I felt like a moth with heavy scarlet eyes and a soft cape of down, a moth about to settle into a sweet bush.
Oh, what a wonderfully metaphorical way of describing it. I myself wrote of my sensual attraction to Kate Anton with the lines, "There is a flower that bees prefer and butterflies desire to gain the purple democrat, the hummingbird aspire."
Oh, isn't it delightful what clever things women can say about one another, and men will miss it altogether. Why, the critics call that one of your finest nature poems and smirk among themselves about how the New England nun was so plain and strange that she hid away in her father's house and garden, watching the birds and bees all day and imagining love affairs with married ministers and journalists she'd only actually seen once or twice in her life.
Oh, yes, it's true. They do say a deal of nonsense about me. But I'd rather like that. Virginia. I enjoy watching all those scholars and critics poring over my poems and papers and declaring she was a mystic. No, she was a religious fanatic. No, everyone can see she's a nature writer. I say she was
an aesthetic.
I say she was an ascetic non-sex. She was a hedonist. Ooh, I love that word. I couldn't have been born their attention while I lived. You see how dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog. I wasn't keen on the public like you were, always walking about saying their names and very little else to one another, it seemed to me. And then, of course, they never would have understood my poetry. They were so steeped in embatic pentameter. My goodness, the words that I tried to come out is just my poet nature. And simple, boring rhymes, schemes, strange that they never learned from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's blank verse. I certainly did.
And I thought Aurora Leigh was the poem that would instill all women with political awareness. I wrote that Mrs. Browning was inspired by a flash of true genius when she rushed into the drawing room and said that here, where we live and work, is the true place of the poet.
Oh, in principle, I quite agree, Virginia. However, even the drawing room became too crowded, too intense for me later on in my life, and I had to have calm solitude of my little room upstairs if I were ever to get anything done. Do you know, when Elizabeth Browning died, as so many of my friends and mentors died, I felt sorrow as profound as if I had known her personally. I imagine I went to her and finding that she had already left us. The turning back, it was so slow.
Oh, perhaps you and I, though, telling of her can bring her back. A happy thought, isn't it? Though her work is probably long out of print, as mine was until very recently. Thank heavens I had the Hogarth, my own press. Or rather, thank Leonard again for starting it up and keeping it going with all his hard work, or I likely never would have even been in print.
Oh, there was a possibility of that unhappy circumstance.
A very strong one. After my first few novels, which weren't all that well received by the critical establishment as it was, my work became so unusual, so experimental in many ways, that I'm sure no publisher would have risked printing it. But Leonard always published what I had to say, though he didn't always see the worth of it. I'm afraid he never understood my political arguments in 3 Guineas, for example. But then, no man is perfect.
Quite true, quite true.
The thing is, Emily, I never could write the same thing over and over again. Never could bear to simply repeat the form that so many others had used, often quite well, I concede, to say what I had to say. I wanted to turn the novel form inside out, to stand it on its head, its tail, all about, actually. I wanted to write prose that was so poetic, and essays that were so dense, and reviews that were so sharp. And all the while I wanted to be so entertaining, so witty, that my readers would laugh with delight and recognition as well. Oh, I see what she's getting at. Of course, they would say.
Oh, I quite agree, Virginia. I myself strove for that laugh of understanding in much of my work. I heard a fly buzz when I died. A funny, don't you think?
Funny and a bit shocking at the same time.
Exactly. It shocks the
pomposity.
Exactly. It shocks the pomposity out of death and leaves one with only the bare thing, the reality, to examine. But of course, others don't understand what I was striving for. I sent a few verses to one of our foremost literary critics, Thomas Higginson. You must have heard of him.
Yeah, I can't say that I have.
How odd. He was so important in my day. At any rate, through Mr. Higginson, I love that name, encouraged me to keep writing. He thoroughly encouraged me to keep writing. He thoroughly discouraged me from attempting to publish. And the comments he made about my poems, well, Virginia, I was terribly embarrassed for him. The poor fellow seemed to lack an imagination altogether. I did enjoy our correspondence, however, and so I continued to seek his advice. But of course, I never followed it. I never changed a single word or line, or even my rather unusual use of capital and dashes to suit him.
Oh, thank heaven for that, Emily.
However, if a man such as Mr. Higginson, a well-read critic, should so misunderstood me, what would others less worldly men, such as my father, have said? I'm afraid I rather used dear Mr. Higginson to distract me from what was really going on at the time. You see, Kate had rejected my outpourings of affection towards her, and I felt a funeral in my brain. That quite frightened me. Although perhaps I really did hope that fame might be mine, but no, then I thought, oh, that admiring bog. I couldn't really want that. In the end, I was so pleased to just remain unknown.
But didn't you have anyone who understood your work and its worth, Emily? It's so important, so vital to the woman writer to have someone she loves and trusts say to her, yes, this is good, keep on with it. 500 pounds a year in a room of one's own is really not enough without that loving support, Emily.
Oh, you're so quite right. I was ever so fortunate in that as the daughter of a professional man, as you termed women of my position, I was given my own room, though I had to pay for it by being always at my father's beck and call while he lived. And though living very plainly, never had to worry about money after he died, still, I did feel frequently deserted as one by one the women I loved, Abia, Sue, and Kate, married and became immersed in their family lives. And the men! So many of the men I was close to died, Virginia. First there was my beloved tutor, Humphrey, and then Austin's friend, Ben, and most wretched of all, Sam Bowles. He and I had such sympathy for one another.
But none of these men or women really understood or supported you in your work, did they?
Well, they didn't really understand it, no, but they did sometimes appreciate it. Sam Bowles published 2 of my poems in his little paper, though nothing came of it. And of course the others thought through enough of my poems and letters at least to preserve them.
Oh, fortunately for us.
Oh yes, late in my life. That is late for me, for I only lived to be 56, and I was rather ill for quite some time before my death, late in life. I did not have the good fortune to be introduced to Mrs. Helen Hunt Jackson.
Oh, who?
You know, the popular novelist and poet. You never heard of her either?
No.
Well, that does not surprise me. She was quite a star in the 60s and 70s. She was an old Amherst girl, you see, and we had been slight acquaintances in our youth. My friend Mr. Higginson had showed her some of my poems I had sent to him, and she came back to speak to me about them. She was very excited and urged me to publish them. You are a great poet, she said, and it is wrong to this day, to the day you live in, that you will not sing aloud.
Oh, that's exactly what I would have said, Emily.
But Virginia, you see, I was so used to them by then, to my little prison, as I called it. I feared invasion if the world did not praise my work. So I demurred through. I did agree, after great urging, to allow her to publish just one short poem, anonymously, in her collection, A Mask of Poetry. Then she presented me and wrote, surely, after you want is called dead, you will be willing that the poor ghost you have left behind should be cheered and pleased by your verses, will you not? Excuse me, Virginia, I must clear my throat. I was very seriously considering making her my literary executor when she herself passed away very suddenly. Again, I was left without an understanding friend.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Emily, you poor dear. One can't help but wonder how different your life would have been had you had friends like the Bloomsburys that I had. Dear, understanding, competitive, fun-loving, serious, and unusual friends to link you to the world.
Oh, you make it sound so quite marvelous, Virginia. Still, I'm not sure. I have a great deal of admiration, you understand, for the way you were able to sustain so many loving relationships, to be out in the world giving speeches and supporting causes, for your ferocious appetite for books, plays, and parties. But frankly, you see, I just don't believe I would have been able to listen, to understand and record that still, small voice inside of me had I led such an active life. I actually preferred to converse with my friends through letters, because in this way I was not distracted by their dear faces and mannerisms, and was able to both hear and say the essence, not the surface, of our friendships.
I quite understand, really, Emily. I carried on a large correspondence myself, sometimes writing Vanessa or Vita twice a day, and often my intensity prevented me from being with others, too. Not to mention my work, hours and hours of work, reams and reams of paper through the typewriter, ideas crowding in from every side, and everything must be right. Not just almost right, but right, you see. Why, I revised the opening paragraphs of Mrs. Dalloway 17 times. It was worth it, of course, for in the end I felt it could not have said it any other way than, Mrs. Dalloway decided to do the shopping herself. Isn't that a lovely enticement to read on?
Oh, it is indeed. How I wish I had the privilege of reading your book, along with my beloved Elizabeth Browning, George Eliot, Jane Austen, and Helen Jackson, of course. I read a few of the men, too. I had my Emerson and Ruskin. Still, it was the women I savored.
Ah, yes. It's odd, isn't it, that men consider it a form of belittlement to say that, oh, Mrs. So-and-so is a woman's writer, when we know that it is the woman writer and the woman reader who care for the real stuff of life, the shopping, the washing up, the tending and the mending, the weaving of the web of reality. I wanted so for my books to be real, to tell the truth and not just the facts of life.
Oh, just as I did, Virginia, just as I did. I wanted to tell the truth from my position on the circumference of life. I felt that if I could only find the right image, the right word, a word that breathes distinctly, has not the power to die, as I said in one poem.
Oh, exactly, Emily, exactly. I wish now that I hadn't died so young myself. I was only 58, so that I could have gone on breathing life into words. But there was so much death around me, my dear, so much death in such a terrible, endless, meaningless war. My own bright nephew, Julian, killed within a week of having gone to Spain as an ambulance driver. Poor Vanessa suffered so terribly that I had to mask a bit my own despair just to help her get through it. And yet it was odd, Emily, when we were in London in the midst of the Blitz, I felt very liberated in a way. I hoped the old house, my father's house, would be blown up, taking the past along with it, freeing me from his ghost, which had never quite left me, though I tried to write him out of it 12 times. Such a good and yet terrible father. If he had lived into my later life, I never would have written, I'm afraid.
So much like mine, it sounds. I longed for so many years to be free of him so that I could have the time, the emotional freedom that I needed for my work. But then, when he finally did die, I felt the grief that never left me. It wasn't until his death and Mother suffered a paralyzing stroke that kept Vinnie and I devoting the major part of our daily lives for the next 7 years to her care, that I realized what Mother's life had been. You see, she had been, through her life of constant service to him and to us, so little present to me that I had declared, I never had a mother. I came to be grateful, actually, for those last years of devotion to her, Virginia, because they restored her to me.
Oh, I understand, Emily.
And so when she did die, I felt that I had not missed her life altogether as I might have. But as you say, so much death. I know people in their graves, I wrote.
Yes, people in the graves, all across Europe. I wanted to keep living, to keep writing, but writing is an act of faith and life. One must believe that life will continue, the writing to continue, for the writing to continue, and I was beginning to doubt. There was a long, very long winter of death in 1941, Emily. Death on a scale that the people of your century could not have imagined. And when spring was coming, and it seemed that it would continue and continue, I felt the old, horrible, and by now familiar signs of madness coming over me, the loss of appetite, the deep anxieties, the crowding of words and images, until I could not put down one for its confusion with another. And I decided not to put myself or Leonard through it again. I filled my pockets with stones and walked out into the water, and that was the end.
Oh, but not the end. Clearly not the end, Virginia. For here we sit together in this fine room, still talking of life, of death, and eternity. And on the talk will go as long as there are presses to print our books and people to read and study them, to talk about them and ponder over them.
Oh, yes, I quite see. I suppose you were right after all, Emily, about that question of immortality. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Virginia, for this wonderful conversation.
Blessings.
Wow. Wow. What two amazing, amazing women, Emily Dickinson and Virginia Wolff. You know, in reading this with Lilith, I discovered things about them that I never knew. And there's so many things that I feel as I read that, as I feel an identity as a writer. So I thank you, Lilith Rogers, for giving me the opportunity to read and for bringing Virginia Wolff and Emily Dickinson together. Who knew? Anyway, you have been watching a special reading by Lilith Rogers and myself, Elaine B. Holtz, of a play or a writing, or what would you call this, Lilith?
I call it a dialogue.
A dialogue between two beautiful, beautiful women who were making all kinds of different advancements for women in their day. Virginia Wolff and Emily Dickinson. You've been watching Women's Spaces. My name is Elaine Holtz. I'm your host and producer, and I will see you the next time.
Your life will do what you must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She knows everything you do because the woman in your life is you. The woman in your life knows simply what is true. She knows a simple way to touch to make you whole now. The woman in your life, she can